You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Maybe that's an urgent message from your CEO, or maybe it's a deepfake trying to target your business. Doppel is the AI-native social engineering defense platform fighting back against impersonation and manipulation. As attackers use AI to make their tactics more sophisticated, Doppel uses it to fight back, from automatically dismantling cross-channel attacks to building team resilience and more. Doppel, outpacing what's next in social engineering. Learn more at doppel.com. That's DOPPEL.com.
Well, it finally happened. It was no joke on April 1st. A flawless launch for the long-awaited Artemis II mission. Like most of us, I was not alive during the Apollo era, so this was the first time in my life I saw humans lift off for a mission to the moon. And my friends, the launch was appointment watching in my household, and like many of you, I prayed, I held my breath, I cheered, and I cried. Godspeed to Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen as they make their way to and around the moon. And the work isn't done, and indeed, for many, the real work begins now, after the launch. But my goodness, you could not have wished for a more beautiful spectacle than that gorgeous launch on the 1st. And less than 24 hours later, the crew has their official go for TLI, or trans-lunar injection, meaning they have the official go-ahead from Mission Control to fly to the moon. Man, I'm so glad I got to finally hear those words in my lifetime. A childhood dream come true for me to see that launch and hear those words, and for many of you too, I'm sure. And a congratulations is due to the many, many space industry professionals across the world, across the United States, Canada, and Europe, and truly everyone who has worked tirelessly for years to see this mission lift off. It is worth saying that incredible feats like this are a massive team effort and international collaboration. Jeremy Hansen is a Canadian Space Agency astronaut, after all, and the service module for the Orion capsule that all 4 crew members are currently in was built by Airbus and the European Space Agency. And there are 4 scientific mission CubeSats that launched with Artemis II as well. They're from Argentina, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. Now, the future of human spaceflight and the future of a human presence on the moon is no solo venture either. No matter how rah-rah USA some of the recent news about a permanent moon base might have sounded, there's that old saying, right? If you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. I'd say the moon qualifies as far. And the news just the day before Artemis II's launch was that Italy signed an agreement with NASA about the upcoming moon base, which will now be jointly built by the United States and Italy. And as a thank you for this cooperation, now at least one future Artemis astronaut will be from Italy as well. And while so many of us were awed by the Artemis II launch, there was another jaw-dropping bit of space news making the rounds on April 1st. Again, no fooling. SpaceX filed for its IPO on Wednesday while we were all a bit distracted, with speculation that the company could be at a valuation somewhere between $1.75 and $2 trillion when it goes public, expected sometime in June. That is 12 zeros in a trillion, by the way, in case you were wondering. Today is April 5th, 2026. I'm Maria Varmazis, and this is T-Minus. For our chat on today's show, I'm going to hand the reins over to friend of the show and Nexus segment host, Parker Wishick of the Aerospace Corporation. In this chat, Parker interviews Brandon Bailey, also from the Aerospace Corporation, and Kaz Vogel, who is Blue Origin's Director of Cybersecurity Governance, Risk, and Compliance. This is a great discussion about all things space cybersecurity priorities and industry collaboration. Here's the conversation.
And you're here in the Nexus, courtesy of the T-Minus Space Daily podcast. My name is Parker Wishick at the Aerospace Corporation. In a recent episode of Nexus, we had a conversation with Aerospace's Brandon Bailey on space cybersecurity, kind of an overview. Today, we're going to talk again with Brandon, and we're excited to be joined by Cass Zek-Vogel, who is the Director of Cybersecurity Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Blue Origin. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the principles Brandon teed up, just that are percolating out in the space domain. But real quick, Cass, if you could describe your role and responsibility at Blue Origin.
Absolutely. So the wonderful thing about C, G, R, and C, those are four letters that absolutely nobody wants to talk about. So in my role, I get to do a lot of really interesting things across a really wide and vast and varied ecosystem. And so I'm accountable for our enterprise information security and privacy programs here at Blue. And so I like to say it's a silent G and a silent R, and or a silent C, and I love to focus in on the R. So that is really, our kind of the central perspective of what I like to do.
And you being here, having your role, kind of exemplifies Blue Origin is leaning forward on space cybersecurity. I know one of the observations is that, that kind of approach to cyber varies across the industry. Different companies are at a different point of the cyber readiness spectrum and commitment to shoring that up. So how do you think the aerospace industry should approach cybersecurity? You can take that on from just an overall posture perspective, or get into the tactical training and simulations wise, but would love your thoughts on that.
So, I'm an Army veteran, and I grew up doing space operations, and that is my core discipline, and it prepared me well to think about cybersecurity in the context of a space ecosystem. And I've been doing this for a few years, and we are in exciting times where we are talking about moving so many capabilities off of this planet and into near Earth orbit and far Earth orbit and really, interplanetary journeys. And that is such an exciting thing to think about. When you decompose space architectures, there are lots of different elements. And the things that are on the ground are a little easier. They're on the ground. You can retrofit them. You can change them out. They're easily patched. But the further off of this planet we get, the more challenging it becomes. And even from a life cycle epic, we have things that are in development, and then they get integrated and tested, and then you get to launch. And launch vehicles have their own set of considerations that are different than satellites. And launch vehicles are a little more like aircraft. And that, we're now getting to the point where we have reusable launch vehicles, and they come back down, and you can retrofit them, and you can patch them, and you can update them. But our space vehicles, we're not there yet. So, in cybersecurity, we talk a lot about our triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I think our community really focuses on confidentiality. It's kind of our default. And it can be to the deficit of integrity and availability. And in, space systems, we have things that are critical not because of confidentiality. They're critical because of safety reasons. And, when you look at a cyber physical consequence, it's more often the loss of integrity or the loss of availability that can have a true mission impact. And so I like to think of getting off of a three-legged stool and having a quad. Let's add safety. We have CIANS. And so, confidentiality, I'm not saying it's not important, but we can't rely entirely on encryption. And we absolutely do need to be thinking about integrity and availability, as we are designing and deploying our capabilities. So I definitely think that having that cyber physical and safety context is really important. particularly for launch vehicles and satellites and lunar rovers and all of the things that are not on this planet.
You mentioned confidentiality against safety, and it's very interesting. You kind of turn confidentiality on its head in the way that the space cyber community collaborates. So I'm going to definitely segue into Brandon, talking about how the community works together to share knowledge. And you were behind one of the key architects behind one of the main public tools that exists out there today to enable that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of space attack research and tactic analysis. That we built that a couple of years ago out of necessity, kind of more than anything else. Is we saw as space policy was coming out from the White House and the threat landscape was changing, that there needed to be some aggregation of information that as these corporations like Blue Origin and others start down this path and get us to Mars and other places, they need a data repository and knowledge base that they can just go to pull from as it relates to threats and what to do about them. So that was kind of why we built it. Based on years and years of information, and it's got pretty good adoption thus far through the community. And from an information sharing perspective, that brings in like the Space ISAC, for instance, is a key tool to share information. So they've adopted what we've built from the Sparta perspective too, as a mechanism to share threat intelligence data and tracking of what adversaries are doing and what attacks are happening out there.
Space ISAC, the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, another one of those convening points in the industry where companies large and small and groups like aerospace and the U.S. government are all collaborating on these challenges. And the Sparta tool you mentioned is integrated in their Watch Center. Sparta started out as an aerospace invention and innovation that was offered to the community public, free of charge. I don't want to call it open source, but certainly the product you put out years ago doesn't look like the product that you have today based on the inputs from the community. So you said adoption was looking pretty great across the community. Characterize that a bit more, and what's the input from the community been like in evolving that tool?
Yeah, so from the community input perspective, it's been we have a email that you just email sparta@aero.org, but most people know me pretty well, so they just reach out to me directly. But we get contributions from academic community and the government and the commercial sector as well. So they basically just send information directly to us about, hey, they give us feedback, or they say, hey, here's a new technique that we discovered, or hey, this countermeasure might need updated in this way. And we keep a running tally of non-aerospace people and their contributions who are willing to be publicly attributed to contributing to Sparta on the website. So if you just go there and look at contribute, you'll see a long list of people that's been there. So it ranges from additions to new techniques, new countermeasures. But one of the things that really has expanded and driven mostly by community feedback is like the additional tooling that we've built in there. There's all these little tools that we build and data correlations and mappings and things that we do, and those are usually user driven. And one example would be on the US side, we focus on NIST 853 as a big governance compliance capability framework that the US government uses. Well, the Europeans use ISO. So shortly after we launched, we had all these NIST things in there. Some Europeans reached out to us and said, hey, that's nice and all, but we don't use NIST here. We use ISO. So could you potentially publish your stuff in correlation to the ISO standards? And I said, well, sure. Okay. So that was something that we did there. And we do a lot of those things as the kind of the community asks for them and what they're looking for. And as new things happen, like there's new tools that are coming out all the time. There's like new standards. We're going to publish a mapping and translation of the new. There's a BSI standard that was put out by the German government on space cybersecurity. So we're going to have a correlation to that pretty soon. The MITRE Embed framework came out last year, so we correlated to that. A lot of people talk about cybersecurity in a lot of different ways and slightly different terminology. And the term I use is the Rosetta Stone of like space cybersecurity. Yeah, sure. there's things over here that make sense. There's things over here that make sense. But like, how does that relate to all the other things that we kind of know about? So you can kind of go to Sparta now and you can kind of see how it relates to NIST, how it relates to ISO, how it relates to MITRE frameworks, how it relates to these various other standards that are happening out there.
And, one of the new evolutions of Sparta, indicators of behavior, maybe we can talk about that a little bit. Partnership with the U.S. government led to those. Cass, you and Blue Origin are using Sparta. Talk about how you're using Sparta, if you could, and, how are you using insights that you gain from the rest of the enterprise and the use of this tool and the collaborations?
So I'll start by saying, I actually started this work pre-DISCAP. And that's dating myself. So I've seen DISCAP and DIACAP and RMF, but I was trained on the Rainbow series, and that was an original body of knowledge from NSA. And it still, to this day, is one of the most valuable tenets that we have. I think that, we are trying multiple frameworks, but I think one of the issues is if you architect and design for compliance, you will not have a secure nor a resilient capability. And, I think that's pretty well understood. So when you're looking, frameworks are inherently compliance framework. They're centric. I mean, that's their whole intent, is to say, here is compliance target. Well, our NIST and even ISO they're very IT centric. And so when you are talking to spacecraft engineers, they look at the control gobbledygook and they're like, I don't know what to do with that in the context of a GNC or an avionics assembly or our EPS subsystem. It doesn't make sense. So what you end up having is you spend a lot of time trying to contextualize the controls for a space platform for discrete avionics assemblies and subsystems. And then if you have, a customer or a third-party assessor, you spend an extraordinary amount of time justifying your control implementation. So here's what I love about Sparta. My favorite part is the spacecraft functional decomposition module. And the reason I love it so much is because it happens to align really nicely with engineering teams. They tend to be, by subsystem. And they, even cybersecurity professionals have a hard time navigating control language and trying to think, well, how do I apply that to, a sun sensor? So it helps them to say, okay, here's my subsystem. Here is a way that could potentially be exploited. And this is where it gets really powerful. Those engineers, as it happens, are really smart. And they understand the low-level design, they understand the software and the hardware architectures, and they get really galvanized around, that's what we're trying to prevent. Well, here's what we can do. And they get really creative. And you just unharness, you unleash all this creative energy that in fact results in a more secure capability. And you just kind of remove this abstraction layer that we find ourselves in. And I actually do consider Sparta to be open source, and I love that about it. And it's also authoritative. So when we're talking to, an assessor or a customer, we can simply say we did threat modeling using Sparta, and here are, when we were looking at our threats and TTPs, here are the countermeasures that we selected, and it correlates to these controls. And all of that mapping is done for the engineers. And then you just kind of remove this philosophical debate about whether or not a control is appropriate or not. And did you meet it? Is that an inaccurate way to do that in the command and data handling subsystem? So you just really, I think it creates efficiencies and it accelerates, the entire development life cycle.
We'll be right back.
When it comes to mobile application security, good enough is a risk. A recent survey shows that 72% of organizations reported at least one mobile application security incident last year, and 92% of responders reported threat levels have increased in the past 2 years. GuardSquare delivers the highest level of security for your mobile apps without compromising performance, time to market, or user experience. Discover how GuardSquare provides industry-leading security for your Android and iOS apps at www.guardsquare.com.
And now a word from our sponsor, Arcova, formerly Morgan Franklin Cyber. Arcova is a global cybersecurity and AI consulting firm built by practitioners who've been in the seat. They work directly with enterprise teams to solve complex security challenges, building secure by design programs that hold up as technology and threats evolve. From focused engagements to long-term partnership, Arcova delivers outcomes that endure, because no one should navigate complexity alone. Learn why leading global enterprises trust Arcova at www.arcova.com. That's ARCOVA.com.
I wasn't aware of that feature. I love that there's layers and layers. If you haven't played around in Sparta or aren't familiar with Sparta or the MITRE framework, it's tactics, techniques, and procedures that kind of flow together in a likely attack chain. I want to say likely attack chain that is comprised. If the database is comprised of both, seen in the field threats as well as lab tested threats. Brandon, maybe talk a little bit about what people are going to see in Sparta, and then I really want to come back to something Cass just said after you're done with that.
Yeah. So it is. Thinking about the inventions or whatever. Like MITRE pioneered. I don't want to take credit for their work that they did, because they kind of set the industry standard on organization of knowledge bases around cybersecurity with tactics, techniques, and procedures. So we just kind of said, hey, well, what's out there that works, and that's what works. So we kind of adopted that. So what you see tactics, techniques in like a matrix format, and a matrix format is good because what you're talking about attack chains, it's multiple permutations can happen, right? So like you can gain initial access from one way, but then from there you can do these 10 other things, and then from there you can do these other things. So it kind of ties together that way. And what we try to do is, like, for every time there's a technique, there's correlating countermeasures. And like one of the things that we do that other people don't do in their frameworks is, like, we are really countermeasure focused. Like, yeah, we document the threat landscape and the threats, but the whole point of that is just to drive the countermeasures that we think need to be implemented. So we're just trying to lower that activation energy for people to say, hey, these are the countermeasures that I need. So you have all the threats, you have a laundry list of countermeasures, and then, oh, by the way, if you pick these countermeasures, it helps you be compliant with these standards that Cass talked about. So that's kind of how it's laid out. And what she's talking about was the spacecraft mapper. That was a feature that we added a couple of releases ago for that purpose of, like, building secure components and secure subsystems in the spacecraft. People were having a hard time, like, understanding how these individual techniques and controls actually apply to, like, a sun sensor or a reaction wheel or a command and data handling subsystem. So now you can just go in there and, like, click sun sensor, and you can see all these things that, like, these are the techniques. And then what we also did was correlate to MITRE common weakness enumeration. So, like, typically these systems or components could have certain weakness types. And what we did was, like, we correlated those to certain weakness types, and then we also correlated those with the NIST 800-160 design principles for secure system engineering. That way, what you said, hey, if I'm building this sun sensor or this subsystem, you can kind of just go here and it's like, oh, these are all the things I need to worry about preventing. Oh, here's all the types of things I should look at. And, oh, by the way, here are the design principles from NIST 800-160 that I should consider to mitigate those. It all kind of ties together. So the whole point is just, like, let's just lower the activation energy for all these people to, like, build the security in. It's like if you do all the hard work once, it's going to make a lot of the stuff on the back end for the actual implementers to be a lot easier. And that's the whole focus of what we're trying to do.
Cass, the way you were talking about how you're using this tool really clicked for me. You're not just playing an arbitrary what if game. You are really bringing these insights, this readiness posture preemptively and proactively into the product design lifecycle, the system design lifecycle. And if you kind of take that thread, to the larger scale, the systems of systems and space ecosystems lifecycle, talk a little bit about how that approach is helping the industry writ large stay ready and innovate in a domain that is marked by threats.
Well,
And for both of you.
yeah, so it's an interesting thing. So when you're trying to approach your design from a risk-centric perspective, part of doing a risk assessment is understanding what's the likelihood that we're going to actually, encounter this threat and actually have an exploit. And so that has been, really challenging. And I'll say that in trying to figure out, in fact, Brandon and I did a really interesting exercise where we looked at a whole bunch of frameworks, and we looked at, we kind of did this heat map based on, it was enabled by the Watch Center and the Space ISAC, and they said, well, here are, the reports that we received, and they kind of said, here are the ones that we're seeing the most of. And so what you can kind of extrapolate that and say, oh, this might be an indicator of where we have the most threat. And so we would be thinking about those sorts of things. And it helps with that likelihood and the actual risk assessment, mathematical approach that you take. And, what the other thing that it does from a technology perspective, whether you're, buying a commercial capability or you're making something, you can kind of say, oh, ooh, interesting. Okay, we know that there's a lot of threat in this area, and yet we have assemblies, avionics assemblies that have no organic capabilities to react. So I would say that's been another one of the interesting things where you could say we have an inadequacy of technology to respond to the threat environment. And if you're trending it over time, that also can help. And so I think not only pointing out where we have technical issues to overcome, it also helps us to, I think, understand, do we have architectural things we need to be thinking about? Because if you have technology and, limitations, you have to kind of think about, well, where can you put countermeasures, if not in the native subsystem?
Jumping on that point, so the whole likelihood conversation, that's a debate always within itself of how likely something is to happen, and it's, you never really know truly. But one of the things we try to do in Sparta, which we've gotten a lot of good feedback on, is we've already pre-prioritized and published notionally what we feel like the likelihood would be, assuming there's a highly motivated adversary that's going to attack your system. Given that we don't understand every design, but like just a notional design, like a standard space vehicle, based on kind of historically how they're built, we've already kind of pre-prioritized the likelihood of those, and given those out to people because a command link injection, a RF based attack is a lot different and more likely than maybe some sort of proximity operations type thing, right? Those are completely different things. And so their likelihoods are going to be kind of different notionally. So we pre-prioritize that for people and to try to give them that leg up of like, okay, these are the things I might need to worry about the most. And that's out there for people to consume as well, because you're not going to be able to mitigate all 150, 200 techniques. So it's like, all right, which 10 do I do? And we've already kind of pre-rated those for people to hopefully help them, start down the right path quicker.
And I think if I may,
Excellent.
the other thing, for anyone who has ever been, I could like to call it a cage match. And that's around space, weight, and power, where those budgets are bogarted by very mean engineers. The chief engineer is unwilling to give up anything. And so when you're thinking about cybersecurity, it's kind of considered an overhead function, not necessarily part of the core mission set. So every single cycle of compute that is used for cybersecurity takes away from the core mission set. And so having an understanding truly of what are the top things that we are trying to protect against, we need to be very, very precise in that. And for that very reason, these vehicles are very swap constrained, and we need to make sure that the maximum swap is for its core mission.
I would love to know what's missing from the nation's space cyber palette. Are there tools or infrastructure components or governing bodies, convening bodies that either need to evolve or that we don't have right now? It can even be an evolution of the Sparta tool itself that you have in mind. We'll start with Cass and then Brandon. What does the nation need more of for space cyber readiness?
There are two things that would be such catalysts for the broader, international space community. The first one would be a cyber threat intelligence heat map. And this has been extraordinarily challenging to even get, a heat map. And, and normally that the intelligence community has all the really great data, and it's really hard for them to figure out how they abstract, all their sources and methods and give an actionable product to even, the American space industry. So that would be one. If we could tackle that challenge, I think that would be huge. The other thing that I would say is that, and this might sound a little funny, but when it comes to space vehicles, satellites, and things that don't return, hopefully, to Earth that we deploy, when you're looking at individual avionics assemblies, most of them do not have the ability for in-flight updates. That is such a basic capability. And if we could do that, we could make so many advancements in terms of our ability to respond to threats over time. And what we know about space capabilities is most of them far exceed their design life. And so we need to be thinking about how do we maintain these? How do we set them up to be resilient for the threats that we don't even know about them yet?
Maybe I'm a little naive. That's a little surprising to hear, Cass, and listeners might agree. Is that just a recent, recognition, or
And
is
I
that
think it's
just
a little bit of that. I think we've been overly focused on encryption. We do over-the-air rekeying. Absolutely. No problem. That's a very well understood thing. But if you're talking about a sun sensor or a reaction wheel, many of those assemblies, they don't do command authentication. They will accept a command from anything. And it may or may well not be, a well-defined command. But they certainly are not necessarily something that you could, while it's in orbit, update. And I think that is very largely true, with the exception of probably encryptors.
Brandon?
I guess on to your first question, what do we need more of? The threat intel heat map is a good one. I think that actually applies almost to about any industry, to be honest with you, is actionable threat intelligence data. And hopefully the Space ISAC, they're helping us get down that pathway. But you're constrained by the data you have, right? You can't just make things up out of thin air. So that's a good one. So I'd be probably a little more technical in my answer, at least from what I'm seeing. The TRL level of some of the cyber technology that we feel like we need to run on these swap constrained environments, I think needs to advance a little more, because they are swap constrained. You can't just throw a new hardware thing up there. There's too much power. There's too much size. Yeah, a software thing may have too much processing. We may not know all the what it looks like. So we try to tackle that a little bit. In Sparta and a few other things. That was the indicators of behavior thing that you mentioned earlier, is because there is close to consensus on the fact that we feel like we should be monitoring for cyber type anomalies and cyber type faults and attacks on a spacecraft. So with that, we pushed out those indicator behaviors last year to educate people on what it could look like so they could build these intrusion detection type capabilities, cyber anomaly detection capabilities on space vehicles. So that TRL is pretty low right now on like being able to detect and respond to cyber anomalies, if you will, on the vehicle. And then thirdly is a less technical thing is more just the knowledge of the threat and the reality and the changing of the on a perception or culture is probably the right word. I get it. Spacecraft engineers, especially ones that have been working in this area for a long time, right? They've built things for 20 years. Nothing bad's ever happened. And then you have the cyber people coming to say, look, the sky's falling, all the bad things are going to happen. And it's like, well, we've been doing this for 20 years and nothing bad happens. And now I got to do all this stuff that I don't want to do. So like, that's a culture thing. And unfortunately, what tends to change those type of viewpoints and culture is these like, black swan type events that tend to happen, globally, that then just change people's minds instantaneously. Hopefully never have to get there to that type of thing, but that's something, just a culture change, and that would be really beneficial, because then you'll open people's minds up, and then all the other stuff. Then you'll have technology investment, and then you'll have all these other things that kind of come downstream from that culture shift.
Cass, I think one area you'd love for the industry to focus on a little bit more is actionable threat ops. Let's talk about that.
So avionics assemblies are amazing. There is no shortage of telemetry, but their telemetry isn't really giving you, it wasn't ever purpose built for cybersecurity indicators. Like in an operating system, you have, security audit logs, but then you also have, application logs and other things about performance and consumption. So avionics assemblies were never built to give us, cybersecurity relevant information about these assemblies that are in space. So what you end up seeing, oftentimes are called a single event upset, which is the space lexicon for, I don't know. It was definitely anomalous. Don't know if it was a solar flare. Could have been a bad actor, could have been a rendezvous proximity up. Who knows what that was? But it's an SEU. But if we had, I think that's kind of where Brandon is going, is to say here are, indicators of behavior or indicators of compromise. And so if you can say, look, here are normal, operations. Here is off nominal. And here are the things that might be an indicator of compromise. You can really shorten, that decision. And we have to. We can't have humans combing through, giant hill stacks of telemetry trying to figure out what just happened. And so that is actually a technology limitation today, I would submit. So I want to see that. You can't get to threat ops if you don't have that context. You can't.
I think that's a great place to end it. There's a whole community of the space cyber community working on just that, on solving all the technical challenges. We got to talk with just two of those folks today, Cass Vogel at Blue Origin, Brandon Bailey at Aerospace. Look for them on the space cyber circuit. If you are interested in contributing to Sparta or joining the Sparta community, visit the website sparta.aerospace.org or email sparta@aero.org. We'd love your input. In the meantime, I am sure that we'll be revisiting cyber in this segment on a future episode. But till then, we'll see you next time here in the Nexus.
That's T-Minus Deep Space, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. We'd love to know what you think of our podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing space industry. If you like the show, please share a rating and review in your podcast app, or you can send an email to space@n2k.com. We're proud that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K helps space and cybersecurity professionals grow, learn, and stay informed. As the nexus for discovery and connection, we bring you the people, the technology, and the ideas shaping the future of secure innovation. Learn how at n2k.com. N2K's lead producer is Liz Stokes. We are mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester, with original music by Elliot Peltzman. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. And I am your host, Maria Varmazes. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week, and Godspeed Artemis 2.
Ever wished you could rebuild your network from scratch to make it more secure, scalable, and simple? Meet Meter, the company reimagining enterprise networking from the ground up. Meter builds full-stack, zero-trust networks, including hardware, firmware, and software, all designed to work seamlessly together. The result? Fast, reliable, and secure connectivity without the constant patching, vendor juggling, or hidden costs. From wired and wireless to routing, switching, firewalls, DNS security, and VPN, every layer is integrated and continuously protected in one unified platform. And since it's delivered as one predictable monthly service, you skip the heavy capital costs and endless upgrade cycles. Meter even buys back your old infrastructure to make switching effortless. Transform complexity into simplicity and give your team time to focus on what really matters, helping your business and customers thrive. Learn more and book your demo at meter.com/cyberwire. That's METER.com/cyberwire.